Welcome everybody. I'm very pleased to be joined by Mike Gomm today. Mike is an expert in the field of technology and disability. He has been involved in that field for over 30 years in the field of special needs technology. He's the owner of Steve Martin Associates, which is a specialist consultancy. So welcome, Mike. Thanks very much for joining me.
Hi, thanks, John. Thanks for inviting me today.
Yeah, so we'll start with a bit of background. If you could just give us a little bit of detail about how you got into the area of technology and disability.
Okay, well, yeah, it's quite a long story, so I won't bore you with all the details. But I suppose the place to start is really that I had a brother who was older than me. He had quadriplegic cerebral palsy, but he had preserved intelligence, and he actually studied at York University and went on to get a PhD from Cardiff. So that gave me a lot of insight into the problems associated with severe physical disability, and also brought me into contact with a lot of the people who were at the time had solutions. And so gradually I got drawn into the area of resolving the problems. And both Richard and I had a very keen interest in IT, and we were getting into the very first Apple computers, the first BBC computers that were coming along at the time, programming them and coming up with solutions for him. And incidentally, if anyone's interested, there are some links from my CV on our page. There are some links to some BBC films of Richard, if anyone's particularly interested in following that through. But through Richard, then I started to meet people, and one of those guys I met was Steve Martin, and I started working with Steve. This is back in the 1980s. Started working with Steve, and we were producing the very first keyboard emulator for the BBC Micro, and that we used sort of down and across scanning with a single switch or two switch system to enable someone to have full control over a BBC Micro. And then that in turn gave them access to word processing and using the device. We then introduced things like word banks, predictive typing, and so on and so on. So and all of those features made access to a computer something realistic for someone with as I say, a very severe physical disability. We also at Elfin, this was the company name Elfin, we developed the very first what's it called? Communication device. I'm trying to think what we called it. It was called My Voice. So it was called a little black box called My Voice, and it was the very first communication aid that used digitized speech. So rather than synthesized speech, which we're all pretty familiar with these days, it used digitized speech, so recordings of another human speaking into the device. And in those days, it was quite revolutionary because at the time, voice synthesizers were pretty poor quality. Things like the Neymal text-to-speech synthesizer. Dolphin were at the early stages of their synthesizer, but the quality in terms of human quality speech was not really there. So digitizing speech was the way to go at the time. So we had those two products, and we had a range of other things, wheelchair controllers and some environmental control interfaces and so on. So that was really my first professional foray into the disability market. Went through a range of other jobs, worked for some other people and other organizations. Eventually I set up my own consultancy, again specializing in overcoming the problems associated with. I tended to work more towards the severe physical disability side of things, and then I got reacquainted with Steve Martin, and he drew me into doing litigation reports. And that's the vast majority of my work these days, is producing litigation reports, Part 35 reports for the court. And so that sort of brings us to today, really. Yeah,
great. So just to give people a bit of an idea of what you might do and the sorts of things you might provide, give me an example, or give me an idea of how you would approach a client that had a high spinal cord injury, for example, the sorts of things you might look at helping them with, and the sorts of technology that you might provide.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so with high spinal, clearly we're just looking at, maybe some head movement. Well, the first thing we would do is we'd want to meet the client. So we'd either do a face-to-face meeting, which we did in the old days. We used to go and see people. Everything now is being done by video, so Zoom, Google Meet, so on and so on. And actually, I have to say, it's working very well. It's working extremely well, got to say. But by one method or another, we'd interact with the client, get to know them, and we'd be able to also assess whether, or have medical information to tell us whether there's any cognition problems and so on as well. So we would understand the client. If we're talking about someone who's probably actually just got a spinal rather than a head injury with additional problems, the first thing I would want to look at is their mobility. How are they moving around? Because before you get into computers and environmental control, it's kind of fundamental to get someone just moving around in their home or in their environment. So I'd be looking at how are they going to control a wheelchair, how are they going to move around, how are they going to navigate through doorways and so on and so on. So that'd be probably the first thing I'd be looking at. It might be that we're looking at, some kind of switch system. I really like, there's a gyro head system, which I really quite like, which is getting some traction here now. But that would be the very first thing. I'd be looking at mobility. Then I'd probably move on to environmental control next, because environmental control is the term we use to describe equipment that lets you control the things around you. So it might be drawing the curtains, turning the lights on and off, simple things like changing the heating controls and so on. But fundamentally, it opens the doors so you can access your rooms or access your property and move around, draw the curtains, open the windows, get some fresh air, control electrical devices and so on. So that'd be the next thing I would want to talk to them about and consider. With a litigation report, we might be meeting someone for the first time in hospital or in temporary accommodation. So we would be talking about their immediate needs. But as I say, within a litigation report, we're looking at lifelong needs. So we would then make assumptions about their future property and allow for that. And if they move into the property before the case goes to court, we would then review the new property and cost that and do the associated work. What I'm always keen to do is look very closely at how are they going to control it. So it's one thing to have lights that you can turn on and off, but how is the client going to interact with that? And I'm really keen on this idea of what we call convergence, where you use one single method of control to control lots and lots of other things. So you might have a method of controlling a wheelchair, which you can then switch into being your method of controlling your environmental control system, or switch into being the method by which you control a computer. So you haven't got to surround someone with lots of switches and joysticks and different things with different bits of hardware. You just use one central piece of kit which they can control really well to control everything else around them. And I'm very keen on that. So when I'm looking at wheelchair, environmental control, computer access, robot arm, which we'll perhaps move on to in a moment, I would be looking to how are we going to control this, and can we do it with just one joystick or one set of switches, or whatever. So yeah, and then perhaps computer control is perhaps the next most important thing. So they can communicate, they can get on the web, they can do their online shopping, banking, so on. They can communicate and keep in touch with friends and relatives and so on and so on. And then, yeah, as I say, something else, which particularly for spinal injury, I'm looking at these days is the robot arm, which is not cheap, but I think where you've got someone who's cognitively able, it's quite an empowering thing. Always want them to have a demonstration or a trial before we make any firm decisions. But I think it's a piece of tech which I've been pushing for a number of years now. But yeah, I'm hoping it will get some traction in the foreseeable future.
It'd be good to have a look at that. I'm just thinking about something like because obviously the sort of technology that you're talking about there, where somebody can control a computer or their environment from a centralized point, is obviously very different to commonplace technology like Amazon Alexa, for example, I imagine a lot of people look at something like that and think, oh, great, you know, it's easily accessible and very usable in terms of somebody with a disability. Is that the case, or is it something that that people can't really use?
You're right. Everyone says, "Oh, Google Home, Apple Home, Amazon Alexa," and they're all great. Let me start off by saying I think they're great and I think they're fantastic. And in our marketplace, they've been revolutionary because they are so cheap, and you have so much potential with them, and you can get off the shelf things that just work. The problem with all of them, though, is they rely on a very good quality internet connection, both externally to the World Wide Web, but more so within the property. So you have to have a very good Wi-Fi signal and good quality Wi-Fi signal within the property. And that's fine while that's working, but I don't know about you, John, but I would say roughly every month I'm having to reset my router because it's stopped talking to me telly, or it's stopped talking to my phone or whatever. I mean, for us, you and me, we're just going on and off, and 10 minutes later we're up and running. Now, if your door opener depends on that Wi-Fi signal and you're in your study and then suddenly the Wi-Fi drops and you've got no access to turning that thing on and off, then you're really stranded and you're in trouble. Particularly also if your alarm call system relies on it, and so on and so on. So whilst I'm a big fan of those intelligent loudspeakers, my view is that it should be the secondary method of control and not the primary method of control. So it might be convenient when you're in the kitchen to say, Alexa, draw the blinds. But if it doesn't work, there should be a primary method which is always available to you, which might be through your joystick or your switch system, which enables you to have that level of control as well. So yeah, I hope that makes sense. Does that make sense? Because it's just not safe to rely on your Wi-Fi connection.
Yeah. It sounds like they've got their place, but it wouldn't be something you'd be looking at using as a sort of primary.
Yeah. Yeah,
system.
that's the key. Yeah, primary. If it's one of the methods, I'm perfectly happy, but there has to be another one. Yeah.
And you mentioned the robot arm. I'm interested to know of a sort of new or sort of up and coming piece of technology that you're particularly interested in. Is that something you're interested in, the robot arm?
Yeah, the robot arm is important, but it's not particularly new. I mean, it's obviously evolving and so on, but it's been around. I think I've been talking about it probably for 5-6 years or so. Something which I am quite excited about, just going back to the intelligent speakers thing, is that there's quite a bit of work being done on improving the quality of voice recognition, which will have a knock-on effect for people with dysarthria. I know it's maybe not specifically to do with spinal injury, but my client group in general often has dysarthria or speech-related problems, and so Google in particular are doing a lot of work to improve the quality of their voice recognition engine, and that will in turn have benefits for people who do use smart speakers, which are great for, apart from controlling things, you can say, add tea and coffee to my shopping list. You can add something to your diary. So, there's all sorts of things that the smart speaker brings to the market, which are important. So I think just improving the quality of voice recognition in that marketplace is really good and key. What else have I got, which I would... there was the gyro set that I mentioned right at the beginning. This is a headset where you can use your head as a sort of a joystick, and so you could just sort of move your head forward, and the wheelchair would move forward. I think that's really good. Haven't seen many in this country, but I think particularly in the spinal injury market, I think it's got potential. And yeah, the robot arm I think is also really, really key. Again, particularly in the spinal injury market and the cerebral palsy market, where the client has a good level of cognition, because it's not particularly easy. Well, I wouldn't say it's easy, but there's a complexity in terms of using it. So I would rule out some of our clients, but the spinal injury market it's an absolute winner, I think. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, I think that's probably it, Mike. I'd imagine that there is so much in terms of specific pieces of technology. For example, the gyroscope that you mentioned, the head control. I'd love to hear more about that, but obviously wanted to keep the interview quite short.
Of course.
But fascinating. I mean, maybe we could do another one at some point. We could look at those specific pieces of technology, which would be really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, we could do one where we actually just show some videos, you know,
Yeah,
show some examples. Yeah,
yeah,
that'd be great.
yeah, great. Well, thanks for joining me, Mike. That's been brilliant.
That's okay. Thanks, John. Thanks for having me.
Take care.
Bye.